Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest webinar by the Energy, Environment and Sustainability Group of the IMechE. The title is The Morals and Ethics of Climate Change and Sustainability, and it's my pleasure to introduce Roger Middleton, who will be narrating this presentation. Roger is experienced engineer and brings experience from the water and wastewater, production, automation, petrochemical and marine industries to bear on a variety of engineering problems with a philosophy of developing technical excellence as a foundation for progress. He also coordinated expertise in the broad disciplines of sustainability, renewable energy, carbon footprinting, energy efficiency, environmental interfaces, and climate change impacts. He's now retired and is a fellow of the IMechE and an active board member of the EESG. Without further ado, I will hand you over to Roger and the presentation.
Thank you. This, as the title suggests, is an ethical exploration by an engineer. It is not a lecture from a moral philosopher. So, with that proviso, we will look at the introduction. We hope to link real engineering situations and questions to personal outcomes, and they will be personal because they'll be different for each one of us. The aim is to stimulate thought and debate to help engineers in their role of honest brokers on climate change and sustainability. And if COP26 is to be postponed for a year, then don't let's relax. Let's use that time to confirm our engineering and moral positions. So let's start with some dictionary definitions. Ethics is the science of morals, moral principles or codes, and I have also used it as a collective noun for groups of morals. Morals themselves have two meanings. The first is concerned with right or wrong conduct or duty, by conscience if not by law, and sometimes those two conflict. The second definition is guidance that you can deduce from a fable or an incident, such as the moral of a story. So I hope that's clear. Some abbreviations. CC is obviously climate change, GHGS is greenhouse gases, CIC is the Construction Industry Council, and RPMP is rape, pillage and plunder. But these questions were prompted by a climate change denier, but I've been interested in the non-technical aspects of climate change for at least 10 years, because it's evident that we are not going to solve this problem through technical issues. So, first question is, do we have a moral duty, perhaps for future generations, to direct people towards a more sustainable industrial strategy? B is, do climate change deniers have the moral right to stand in our way? And if they do, who decides between the two? Third is a bit more historical. Do mechanical engineers, having enabled the Industrial Revolution, have a moral duty to clean up the unintended as well as the obvious consequences? And do educated and aware people, including our politicians, have the moral right to do nothing when our industrial consumer economies are taking us and a whole slew of other species, from the iconic to the insignificant, rapidly towards extinction? Or perhaps should I be a fatalist? Is this just the way evolution is supposed to be? Am I being arrogant and selfish in just trying to prolong the agony for my grandchildren? So this title of this slide is a quotation from G.K. Chesterton, rather apt. Unfortunately, there's lots of misinformation from vested interests, and hence there's lots of misguided legislation. Let's get it right first. Climate change is not a cause, it's an effect. The cause is our emissions of greenhouse gases and heat from burning fossil fuels at large scale for 250 years. Hydrocarbon fuel energy storage density has been a huge boon for transport and industry. It has about 40 times that for electric batteries. But it has terrible consequences for emissions, for air quality, energy and time wastage, and for human health. And it's not just climate change. All of these problems are connected, and most of them are caused by mankind. So we have water pollution and warming through power stations and other things. Building development, cement and concrete comprise 40% of our carbon dioxide emissions. Resource depletion of all sorts, not just minerals, but including fish stocks, soil, humus, carbon and resilience, and that leads to food nutrition security issues. Solid and liquid waste discharges, including the throwaway industrial and consumer economy that carpets our ocean beds and the surfaces as well, including our landscapes and soils. We certainly need a holistic approach as per the IMechE 2020 themes, and because the requirement is for detailed skills as well as big picture awareness, we need collaboration on a large scale. But the biggest challenge in all this is to disconnect any form of development from population growth, because that just causes more growth and more problems. So for a research project, we should start by checking the existing literature, and it's fairly sparse. But the result of my researches are that there are three main issues. First of all, that it's global. Anybody polluting the atmosphere anywhere around the world affects everybody. It's the tragedy of the commons. The second item is that it's intergenerational. It lasts for centuries. CO2 stays in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. So, Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion are morally right. It will be much worse for those that follow. The third issue is that uncertainty in science, in social and environmental justice, and in outcomes. There seems to be no precedent, but we'll tackle that a little bit later. On existing literature, I'm also grateful for Ian Arden's paper from the John Ray Initiative, and we'll pick out some items from that as we go. So what are our main tasks as engineers, and what is the moral baggage that goes with them? The first thing we have to do, in accordance with the energy and transport and other hierarchies, is reduce demand and consumption. The problem is that if we take that on the existing economy, it reduces our GDP, which makes the country look bad. So we have to take those numbers out of GDP first. Item 2 there, D times 2, is double and decarbonise our electricity generation. And as a secondary but very important issue, to get off thermodynamic processes, because that will increase the efficiency of our electricity generation and consumption from 20% to about 80%. We have to decarbonise our transport fuels for systems that won't go electric. And we have to decarbonise building and development. And for that, I'm grateful that the Construction Industry Council has set up a collaboration called the EDGE, in which the IMechE is participating. We also have to re-establish land according to natural systems. We have to minimise water and chemical use. No rape, pillage and plunder allowed here. Resource depletion is certainly rife. We need to get to a no-waste circular economy very quickly indeed. And the moral lesson from all this is that industrialisation is actually fairly easy. It chimes with our human ambitions, our ingenuity and our desire for betterment. But after we've exhausted all the local resources, things get much more difficult, and post-industrialisation is much harder. Have we had a chance to do some of this stuff before? Yes, we have. The first lecture I ever went to at the IMechE was presented by Professor Salter on his ducts, one of the big examples of wave power technology. There were lots of devices around that stage. Yes, most of them would have failed, but in the intervening period, we've lost 40 years. In the late 80s, and 1988, Prime Minister Thatcher and President Reagan very nearly signed a carbon limiting deal, but the US coal lobby pulled out, and it probably did the same thing in 2018 too. In the early 2000s, John Egan's review of building standards and Part L building regulations was quite sweeping, but the government were bullied by the building and construction industry into carrying on regardless. So in the 2020s, we have the worst insulated and the most energy-hungry housing in Europe. Is that something to be proud of? In the mid-2000s, Lord Stern warned that dealing with climate change would be cheaper the earlier we started. But we're still high on gas and coal, and my recent fuel bill mix said we were consuming 67% gas and 4% coal. The 2007 and 8 economic system crash was an opportunity for correction. Did we do it? No, we didn't. We just patched it up and carried on. There are lots of messages coming out of the current crisis. So, will we patch it up and just carry on? Or will we take some of those lessons to heart and deal with some of the issues? That's the negative side. Some of the more positive stuff is our achievement so far. We've reduced coal by shutting the pits. Still lots of coal underground, but we've gone on to North Sea oil and gas. But we're also increasingly importing oil and gas. We've developed a token biomass fuel power station, but that is dependent on imported wood fuel pellets from huge areas of softwood forest in the southern USA. They've developed a complete transport link, railroad and railways, a new shipping line and port facilities both ends, more trains at this end just to get those pellets to the power station. Certainly a major engineering and logistical achievement, but certainly not carbon neutral. Is it sustainable? Only time will tell. We've offshored our manufacturing industries, causing great hardship in the manufacturing labour concerns. But then we pretend that the other countries' emissions incurred in making products that we demand are not ours. If we start to take some responsibility for those emissions, then we can make progress at COP26. But the real problem is that because they're cheap, we don't value the products, so we throw them away. Hence the vicious circle of resource depletion, waste generation, and yet more emissions. And the substitute service industry that has taken the half of manufacturing often adds cost and not value to all our imports. So those on low incomes can't afford some basic products. We've also reinvented wind turbines and mass-produced them for our highlands and our territorial waters. But let's be careful about this because most of the intellectual property is owned overseas. And the only tangible outcome of the Stern Review is the commitment to the Act to get to net zero by 2050. So why have we missed all those opportunities? Well, it's certainly not technology. It's human nature. A large part of this is what I call caveman economics. We exploit and then we move on. We leave a wasted desert, and that is morally bankrupt, rape, pillage and plunder. On the other side of that, the Harvard MBA class of 2009 signed up to an oath, which was revived in 2018, and basically very cruelly summarized, that is, create value ethically and responsibly. Now, I don't know why it was restricted to just those two classes. To me, that ought to be in every MBA course as a core element. On perhaps a slightly lighter side, Sting wrote a song about faith in 1992, The line there is, never saw no miracle of science that didn't turn from a blessing to a curse. I think we can all think of examples of that. My favourite was on the cover of the Professional Engineer magazine quite a few months back, about a chap who had mastered CAD and 3D printing to produce a prosthetic arm for his son. But on the web, you can get 3D printing instructions to produce a gun. So those are two extreme examples of human nature. There's also the Jevons paradox, amongst other things. We do things because we can, but we shouldn't really, so we need some fairly major education in some of these issues. Other aspects of human nature are that we sometimes misinform ourselves. So let's be clear, sustainability and economic growth are not compatible, but we cannot afford to alienate the high flyers and the economists who thrive by the existing system by trying to force on them a social equity agenda, because we need their skills to get through all this stuff. And I agree with Will Self when he says cognitive dissonance is rubbish. Let's say it straight. It's hypocrisy. And as an example of that, we always say we care about other species, but we're busy trashing their habitat. So we don't realise that we are a part of nature. We are not apart from it, and we have no moral right to take other species to extinction with us. Okay, so for those engineers who love equations, here's your salvation. The IMechE equation comes from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it was originally formulated for the CAFE fuel standards in the USA. It basically says that our impact on any system is proportional to the population's affluence, and the technology it uses. So notice the splits in blue underneath those headings: 45% social issues, 45% economic, and 10% technical. So engineers have to solve the whole problem, but we're only allowed to play with 10% of the scope. Isn't that typical? But as part of society, we can influence the social and the economic. So we're not just limited to the technology. And this is important because it allows us to view what we are doing in our day jobs. So what about our products and our projects? Let's treat this as a training day. Get out of the smoke and mirrors at the coalface, and let's see where the flames are coming from. Are your projects carbon neutral? So let's have no vanity projects, no extreme bridges, please. No vague promises of future carbon offsets, and no dodgy carbon accounting. Are your products high quality, long life, energy and materials efficient, and fit for a circular economy? Your new cities may be smart, but are they geographically sound? Remember, a city survives on its hinterland. And does your output of any of these things stand a triple bottom line or a PESTE analysis? Stepping even further back, what is your industry's long-term plan? How far away is 2050? And will you be at net zero by then? One of the issues that comes out of all this is, are you competing or collaborating? Because the latter is far more fun and much less wasteful of ideas, people and time. I said we'd come to the unprecedented stuff. We say we're in uncharted waters, but we're not entirely. We have abolished slavery, gradually, mostly, and certainly if we want to be fashionable, we don't wear animal skins or furs. So we can change habits, but our mindset is critical. And I was taken here by a comment from somebody calling themselves Iruka on a George Monbiot article in The Guardian. And that person said, our lifestyle is how we were brought up. It validates us, so we must obey it. So is it intransigence or obedience? that makes us resist changes in the face of climate change and sustainability. Whatever, we need to get ourselves around this and get it right to win the moral battle for hearts and minds. Some personal questions come out of this and the examination of our industries and ourselves. How old will we be in 2050? Does this date fit our career or life plan? Are we mentoring or recruiting the next generation of graduates? And what are they thinking about all this? It's their future. They'll cop it far worse than we will. Do you have any children, or do you plan for them? What will they think? And what might they ask you when they reach that curious age and they won't take no for an answer? What advice would you offer when they're looking for careers? We need to think ahead and put ourselves in their world, and it might help if we start now. These are the intergenerational moral questions that Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion are absolutely right to ask. We often have moral dilemmas in our work, perhaps specific to some industries, such as defence, oil and gas, or tobacco. So these answers will be separate, and they will be personal. But I would encourage you to separate them from any company or industry mantra. But I will admit that living a sustainable life and earning a living in the engineering world can be difficult. Getting a bit more personal now, if the creator who ordered the Big Bang and wrote all the rules has decided that human beings are going to go extinct anyway, am I being arrogant to try and stand in the way? Perhaps I might be being selfish, just wanting my grandchildren to enjoy the earth as I've done. Or, on the other side of that, do I have a moral duty to hand it down in at least as good a condition as I found it? I've struggled to answer some of those questions, but a recent review of Roger Scruton's analysis of Wagner's opera The Ring of Nibelung led me to think that unlimited wealth and power will kill us unless we incorporate into our life love and sacrifice. And inferred in all that is that we cannot fall back on any God's mercy or will. We've got ourselves into this mess, and we have to get ourselves out. And if God is testing us, then perhaps that is our test. But the nub of this whole moral issue is that if we collaborate and do as we know as we should, we might just about deserve to survive. But if we persist in futile and selfish power games, we would deserve our extinction. So that enables us to answer the questions that came up on slide 4. Should we be pushing for sustainability? Yes. We have the technology, we have the wealth and the means. We just need to push those without the moral fibre a little bit harder. Do climate change deniers have a right to stand in the way? No. I believe they should check Pascal's wager, and you can get information on that on Google, no problems at all. Note that it is also quoted by Warren Buffett in connection with climate change, so this is highly relevant. Should engineers clean up after themselves? Yes, indeed, as far as our influence allows, although I will admit that that is sometimes very limited. Is there a moral right for our leaders and politicians to do nothing? Absolutely not. Again, check Pascal's wager. One of James Lovelock's quotations is, why worry about this civilization? There'll be another one along in a few million years. Is he right? Yes, perhaps. But we owe it to our grandchildren to try anyway, and we may even pass the test. Now, to some extent, the answers to our personal questions will depend on our beliefs. And I was grateful to be able to attend a multi-faith conference organised by the IMechE Medway division on climate change and sustainability in autumn 2018. The many different faiths there seem to agree that a core value of all of them was earth stewardship. So why, apart from one or two exceptions, have our church leaders been so quiet? They've missed out on 2 generations of environmental activist followers to whom they are now pretty irrelevant. Notice on Pascal's wager that you don't have to believe in any God at all. You don't need any religion. You just need ethical behaviour to achieve a favourable outcome. If we believe in the politics and media, they just get more subjective and divisive. And the Brexit debate is a good example of that. There was almost no background rationale, just argument and conflict. We cannot afford to play power games on climate change, and any control engineers out there will tell us that the system time lag between input and response means that we are playing catch-up already. And for the atmosphere, our best guess for that time lag is about 40 years. But in that conference, it was the pagan representative who made the most impression on me, and I suspect on the rest of the meeting too. He highlighted the stark possibility of no deities, no prophets, no martyrs, no hierarchies, and no promises of an afterlife. There are no distractions. The earth is all that we know we have. And he left us with a poem, and I shall do the same.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. It was very informative indeed. We have now a question and answer session, and I'll move swiftly on to the first question. Right, I'm getting some feedback here. Bear with me. There we go. So the first question is, Pascal's wager has been mentioned in a couple of places. So could you give some idea of what that is to save us all leaping onto Google and finding out? Because it seems to be something that you focused on quite a lot.
It is, Michael, and it's very much at the heart of morals of politics and what's happening or not happening on climate change, which is why I brought it in there. There are lots of philosophical concepts that might well be relevant, but this one rang a particular bell with me. What Pascal said back in the 1700s, mid-1700s, 1760s, I think, was that it's futile to bet on the existence of God because we just don't know. So the outcome of that possibility is a 50-50 chance. He may exist, he may not. And I'm referring here to anybody's God. So what do you do about it? Well, you look at the consequences. So if you spend your life on this planet trashing our environment, behaving badly towards people in your general scramble to accumulate more power and wealth, then when you die, there are 2 possibilities. If God does not exist, you won't have gained or lost anything. But if God does exist, you may well find yourself consigned to hell for eternity. On the other hand, if you treat the earth lightly, if you treat other people well, and you behave generally morally well, then when you die, those 2 possibilities still exist. God may not exist, in which case you haven't lost or gained anything, but if he does exist, you may well have deserved something a little bit better than hell. Now, the beauty of all this is that if you take it through to its logical conclusion, you don't have to believe in anything. You just have to act morally. And that's the nub of the whole thing here. And that is why I think Warren Buffett took it up in relation to climate change on one of his annual reports for one of his many companies. He said, if I run this company as though climate change does not exist, I will make lots of money. But in 10 years' time, I might find myself with a problem. If I run this company as though climate change does exist, and I really don't know at this stage, then in 10 years' time, I won't have a problem, and I won't have lost much money. So I will run it as though climate change does exist. In other words, he will behave morally. And I think that's applicable to most people and most executives in this situation.
Thank you very much, Roger. A bit of feedback there. So, can you turn your microphone off when I'm speaking? Just check. That's better. No? Nope, still getting it. Okay. Well, I turned my speaker off in case it's me. So my apologies if that feedback is still happening. Moving on to the next question. In the current situation, how can or should our engineering industries and professional institutions be preparing, planning, and acting to enable a more sustainable and fair future rather than return to 2018 or 2008 status quo?
I think this is an excellent question and brings the current positive aspects of the situation out to the best. We heard just this morning on the Radio 4 Today programme an interview with the chap who's running the Ventilator Challenge project in this country, where he's saying that if you cut out all the noise and if you collaborate instead of competing, you can bring engineers, buyers, all sorts of other people together, and you can achieve what would normally take months in a few days. And the outcome of that has been absolutely phenomenal. And it's not just engineers in here. We're talking the armed services. Obviously, the NHS are at the core of this. There are all sorts of issues that we can do in the normal engineering day job to accelerate what we do. But yes, I also have reservations about what will happen at the end of this crisis, because obviously the Chancellor has spent an awful lot of money, and conventionally he would fall back on economic growth and a return to the normal status quo as quickly as possible. But I think some things have to change. There have been rumours about a particular airline wanting bailouts. I think that should go. I think the fewer airliners we have polluting our skies, the better. I think we should plan perhaps to work from home or from a local business hub, perhaps 3 days out of home. 3 days out of 5. And the rationale behind that is also on one of the slides. I mean, I've worked with colleagues who spend between 4 hours on a good day and 6 hours on a bad day just getting to and from the office. That is horribly unproductive, and it's wasteful of energy and their thinking time, their health and their sanity. So there are lots of things that we should be doing. I mean, electronic meetings. It's not only the 2008 crash. Yes, I think Gordon Brown made quite a few cogent comments at one of the pre-events for one of the COP conferences a couple of years after the 2008 crash, where it became pretty evident to him that a lot of the bailouts and the money that was pumped in to recover from the 2008 crash actually went straight into people's personal wealth. So that was obviously unethical. But other things came out of that too, and I think given the chance he might handle things very differently now. Whether the current government will be able to learn from that is a moot point. There's a well-known interview with an ex-minister who was asked why the oil industries and some other people have an inordinate effect upon parliamentary time, and environmentalists don't even get a look in. And he said, well, that's quite simple. If I want to talk to an environmental expert, I have to make an appointment. If I want to talk to an oil industry member, I just open my office door, and there's two sitting out in the corridor. So the people with the money do have an inordinate influence on what happens in governments, and it's not just the UK. That's obviously true in the US and maybe true elsewhere. So, yeah, I have reservations about what we will do, but certainly what we should be doing is some of these issues are quite harshly pointed out in the current crisis. The benefits we've also seen. My son in Colombia, in Bogota, he was within a couple of days, that city was within a couple of days of being shut down because of air quality. And since the virus has effectively shut the city down, they can now look across the city and see mountains they've never seen before. And you can pick that up on the NASA website. I think that's on quite a few Google and other sites too, about before and after virus pollution levels over Europe and China, and possibly over the States as well. I mean, the pollution levels have dropped enormously. So if we can benefit the environmental issues in just a couple of weeks, imagine what we can do with a much more concerted effort. Okay, it appears that we have a problem with reading the questions. I've lost Michael, I think. So I'll go on to the next question that I've picked up here. And it says, as we switch over to renewable supplies of energy, many of these come with life cycle costs not associated so much with fossil fuel power generation. So things like cobalt and lithium are needed for batteries. And they involve significant ethical considerations as well. How do we balance these competing objectives? This actually goes also with a later question about should engineers become political activists. No, I'm not advocating that we become political activists, but what tends to happen in engineering and in lots of other industries too is that we develop expertise in our little pigeonholes, but we lose sight of the big picture. And if we're in the development of a particular concept or an engineering project, we tend to lose sight of the bigger effect and the global effect of what we're doing. And yeah, I've been guilty of this in past career times too. It might be a little bit easier for me in retirement to look upon these and see the bigger picture. So no, I'm not advocating political activism. What I would say is that whatever position you are at within engineering, from a junior student engineer member, that sort of thing, right up to senior executives or even political, scientific and engineering advisors, we need to keep that combination of particular detailed expertise and big picture awareness, because that's the sort of thing that enables us to be these sort of independent advisors to government that mean that we're the honest brokers. We don't have too many axes to grind. We don't stand to benefit from any of these advocacies and any of this advice, but we can put the world on a slightly better footing and put our countries and companies on a slightly better footing with a longer term view.
Thanks, Roger. So you have a question here. The ethics of climate change is extremely important. However, no matter what we do in the UK, it will only account for a small percentage of the CO2 that is causing an issue. What do we do with nations like China that are building more fossil fuel power stations than are being closed in Europe? Also, other large nations like the USA are not committed to tackling the climate change problem. So if we do everything possible in this country and in Europe, it will only be a drop in the overall ocean of pollution when you take into account other polluting nations. How do we overcome this problem?
Right, thank you. I think the first point to make is why are there so many Chinese and Asian students at our top universities and engineering educational establishments? The answer is that we are very good in this country at doing education. Okay, they learn a lot from us, and in some cases they then go on to innovate better than we are. Yes, the Chinese Chinese are still building fossil fuel power stations because they perceive development as a means of reasserting their dominance on the world. That's fine up to a point, but then you also realize that they are also instrumental and indeed the leaders on generating renewable energy. Nobody is putting more resources into renewable energy than the Chinese. And, I don't know how much of this is available on the web or how much of this is available through diplomatic and other exploratory channels, but it's pretty evident to me that that's been happening for some years, because the Chinese particularly realize that they can't go on polluting their atmosphere to the extent that they are, because they now have the same problem that we had in the UK in the 1950s and 60s before we enacted the Clean Air Act that stopped open coal-fire burning, because that was creating smogs that meant that you couldn't see 10 feet in front of your nose, and it was creating all sorts of health problems. And those issues kill everybody, from the poor to the top executives in government. So it's completely deliberate. And the Chinese realize they've got to get off of that. So first, we can provide a technical lead. We can also provide a moral and educational lead. And we can also rest assured that Chinese and other countries are working towards renewables and getting off fossil fuel power as fast as possible.
Thanks, Roger. We've got a comment and a question here. There is a more fundamental question to answer, regardless of whether we believe anthropogenic climate change is a valid theory or not. Do we, as the human race, have a duty of care for the way in which we act as stewards of the planet?
Yes, I think that's very relevant. And I'm afraid to say that I think our religious leaders have been somewhat lax in this. As I mentioned on the slides, the multi-faith conference organised by the IMechE local people in Kent that we went to in autumn 18 was quite clear on that everybody we spoke to had earth stewardship as pretty core to their beliefs. And in which case, why have they been so quiet about it? So yes, there is a major moral issue on this, and I think we do well to pick up on this. And the inference behind that also is that we may be taking ourselves towards extinction, and that may be our own decision, but we also have absolutely no moral right to take other dependent species with us. So yes, that is another side of the moral argument.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question here. As a fellow of the IMechE and former Green Party parliamentary candidate, I do not agree that economic growth is necessarily unsustainable. It can be seen as morally wrong to enact policies that damage economic growth. Eliminating poverty and increasing global wealth is one route to decreasing population growth. Advancing healthcare, improving our ability to cope with climate change, and developing zero and negative carbon technologies. To my mind, Greens, myself amongst them, have been guilty in the past of inhibiting technological innovations such as advanced nuclear power and GMOs that we need to bring sustainability.
Yes, I think that's fine. I think that's conventional economics against zero growth economics. And I think where the conventional economics falls down is that in a democracy, everybody is scrambling for a bigger share of the pie. The delusion is that in a global economy, there isn't any more. And that is the nub of that whole situation that we're beginning to realize. Again, that is being shown up in the current situation where we have decided some, 30 years ago to go to a service economy and to ditch largely our manufacturing economy. Now we're finding in a crisis, not only are we having difficulty sourcing important critical equipment because everybody else in the world wants it too, but we don't have any control over it. So I have a lot of sympathy for our ministers who are trying to do this stuff, because we don't have any control. There are indeed further issues on this, in that the locust plague that is currently besetting parts of East Africa, if on one of your 2 weekly trips to the supermarket you check out green vegetables, for example, a lot of that comes from Africa, everywhere from the Cape right up the east coast to Cairo. And if the locusts get there first, there won't be any left. So again, we've outsourced our fundamental resources to somewhere where we have no control over the input there. So yeah, that's conventional economics, and I think that's where it falls down. But please, don't depend on my inexpert advice on that. There's a recent book out by the ex-governor of the Bank of England. His name escapes me for the minute. Mervyn King. It's called Radical Uncertainty. He reviewed it on a Radio 4 program called Start the Week on the 9th of March. You can get back to that and replay it. He also had other guests on there as well, so that was interesting. And he said, for example, he found that economic forecasts are not reliable. And that is because, I believe, the science is incomplete. As an example of this, when I did atomic theory back in my student days, we had to learn 3 different versions, because no one version of the atomic theory as it was then explained or understood explained what happened differently in chemistry, metallurgy, and electronics. And now, I'm sure the atomic theory has progressed since then, and I trust that in future decades, economic theory will also change. But Mervyn King is far more of an expert on this than I am, and there are other people as well who are more expert on the zero-growth economy, which is perfectly viable and, to me, makes a lot more sense in a finite global world.
Thank you, Roger. So the next question we have, at what point will environmental engineers be taken as seriously as safety engineers, such that the death of the planet will be taken as seriously as death of individuals?
Excellent question. As a mechanical engineer who used to work in the construction industry, where still the major cause of death is falls from height, basic stuff, falling off of ladders, falling off of scaffolding. It really is elementary. Well, I think we've changed attitudes to a certain extent through education. So again, returning to the construction industry, we now don't go onto a site and start clearing everything on it, every tree, every blade of grass, and level the whole site. Certainly the clients that I used to work for would not allow that. That would be very adverse publicity for them. So we are learning. I think there are lots still left to learn. And again, in our quest for resources, as the question asked about resources for new technology like batteries, we have to be very careful that we're not jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, because we don't yet properly understand the interaction of all these elements that we choose to push to one side. And again, some of our scientists, environmental engineers and other people know bits of this, but there are very few people who can look at the big picture. And as an example of that, I'm afraid I have to return to an institution that shall be nameless. Their periodical came out on the subject of upland ecology. And overgrazing, which is the major problem on upland ecology across pretty much all of Europe and certainly across the whole of the UK, was hardly mentioned. And you think, okay, we've got whatever it was, 8 or 10 exceptional papers, lots of interesting research there, but the overriding concern was totally missed. And you just wonder how that can happen. So I think there are some issues here where obviously there are issues where environmentalists are seen as barriers to development, and one of the major issues here is that our Environment Agency is still only advisory to government. So it can advise government and local authorities against development in floodplains, but ultimately it can be overruled, and is obviously regularly overruled on a routine basis. And the only time it comes to prominence and people start believing in the Environment Agency again and stopping the cutting of its funding is when we get a disaster like a few years ago on the Somerset levels. So these things are very much have to be kept in balance, and it's a difficult political juggling act to maintain. But yes, I think we do need to take a lot more consciousness of the big pictures here to make sure we keep things in perspective.
Thank you, Roger. So the next question we have, how do we tackle the problem of misuse, overuse and wastage? That is the social and affluence part of the equation.
That's interesting too. I think one of the problems of offshoring our industry and obtaining things where they're cheapest is that when we buy those things from overseas and we ship them in by the container load, because they're cheap, we don't value them. So we throw things away. And there's an excellent presentation that was given to the Energy, Environment and Sustainability Group about 4 years ago, I think, by Professor Roland Clift of Surrey University, where he said, if you're in a quandary about what to buy your partner for Christmas, buy her the Gucci handbag, right? Because she won't throw it away before New Year's Day. She will value it for life, and it is sustainable because all the materials are sustainable. They will have been properly resourced. Everybody in the supply chain will have been paid properly, and its carbon footprint will be negligible. But most of the Christmas presents we buy are cheap and will be thrown away by New Year's Day. And that is the crime that we are all committing. So yes, I think we need a major change of culture here. And no, it's not just the UK. This happens in overseas cities, markets, and cultures as well. And I'm afraid that, yes, because we do produce things cheaply, we don't value them, hence the waste issue.
Thank you, Roger. So the next question asks if you're able to expand a little bit more on how to decouple development from population growth.
Right. Well, again, I'm probably not the right person to answer this because I'm an engineer, not an economist. But certainly it occurs to me in looking at economic and other growth issues that we're following the classic population curve. It starts off somewhere below a level which is sustainable, so that's fine, but then it begins to accelerate. The curve gets steeper and steeper until we crash. And that is the classic biological population curve. Where we are at present is obviously way above the sustainability line, and the curve is getting steeper. And that doesn't matter whether you're measuring in terms of cars on the roads, pollution levels, buying waste products and throwing them away, population, economic growth. All these things are highly interrelated, so it all goes together. So, for example, the energy that we spend and the time that we spend commuting to and from work every day all contributes to our gross domestic product. And that is why I say in the slides we have to seriously look at that sort of culture so that we can take it out of our GDP figures, so that when we start to economise on that and come to our senses on some of those issues, we don't harm our perceived economic wealth. Because in fact that should lead to greater productivity, it should lead to greater sanity, more clarity in some of the decisions we make, and an enormous saving, as we are making now, in energy. I mean, our current electricity generation supply and demand during the COVID crisis is way back to below what it was in the 1970s. So we have already, in this crisis, made major energy savings that, I guess, I would be very reluctant to go back on, because to achieve some of the global sustainability and the climate change issues that we have to achieve, we're going to have to do that all again. So let's start from here rather than going back to the same old, and having to do it all over again. But again, I'm not the ultimate on that. Have a look at, I think, Professor Tim Stevenson, again from Surrey University. He, again, talks about zero economic growth, and I think that is partly about decoupling development from population growth. It doesn't just happen in this country. If we try to stimulate development in even in places like Africa, if it's not appropriate development, that leads straight to population growth. Have a look at the population of Malawi over the last 30 years. It's a great example, and they're now coming through their crisis.
Thank you, Roger. So next question, it states, it says that you're advocating engineers becoming political activists. For the sake of transparency and conflict of interest, are you able to please make clear any affiliations you have with political parties or activist organisations?
Yes, indeed. That's an important point. I'm not a member of any political party. I have very few party political views, so I've no affiliations there at all. If there was one, I'd be somewhere between the Monster Raving Loony Party and the Common Sense Party. I'm not even a green activist party. One, because I don't think I'd be very good at it. Two, because of some of the reservations I've expressed in the slides. But also, I think one of the issues that we have to grab hold of, preferably before COP26, whenever that happens, is that we have to plan properly with resources and a critical path analysis how we achieve net zero by 2050. Now, Friends of the Earth have done this, but I'm afraid they've missed out enormous parts of the problem. There's another organisation, which I think is the Energy Systems Catapult. That does a slightly more thorough job on it, but again, there are holes in their analysis. So I think we need to get around to those sort of things rather than becoming political, to examine the feasibility of the target that we've set ourselves and say, can we do it? Have we got the resources? Do we have the expertise? With the current model of the COVID crisis and the collaborations that we're achieving now, yes, I'm sure we can do it. But if we slip back into the same old ways, I'm sure we won't.
Thanks, Roger. Would we be better if we had more engineers and scientists in Parliament and government? And if so, how do you think we could achieve that?
This is a good one. Yeah, I don't think we can, because we find engineering and science far too interesting to get involved in Parliament and politics. And indeed, that's a large portion of what I just said on being a political activist. One or two engineers and scientists who have influenced our politics have done very well. But if you look, for example, Professor Sir David Mackay, he had a major part to play in DEC over a few years. He built the department up to a major economic and engineering and technical force in government, and the following minister that came in dismantled the whole thing completely. So politics is far too short-term to make an engineering career of, unless you're really up for that sort of thing. It is a problem, but I think we can advise, and I think we should take more confidence in the advice we give parliamentarians.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you very much for your time today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I'd like to thank you, Roger, for taking the time to give this webinar today, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you found that useful and enjoyable, and I hope you all have enjoyed the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. We can, if you can still hear me, access all the questions that you ask, and we will attempt to answer those on a future forum. Thank you.